So did you remember which Bible story the rainbow shows up in? Remember what it means? Say what?
I will no longer do war with you, I will bring you peace.
Yes, at the end of the Noah's Ark story, right? And I will remember my covenant with you. Did you enjoy the thunderstorm Thursday night? Yeah. I was sitting here in my office looking out, and so I got to see a bunch of stuff. Panoramic light show. At some point I heard the running footsteps of a choir member who went racing outside. Perhaps there were windows open in their cars. What about last week on Saturday? The storm started somewhere between the main course and the dessert course of the progressive dinner. And so we got to drive in the lightning down to the church for dessert. And while we were here, boom, one of the light poles right out in front got struck and started to burn. That was added excitement. We go running around, what's happening, what's happening? Somebody called 911. A couple of us went out and moved our cars. The police came, they successfully blocked the road, so about the time we were all ready to leave, we couldn't. You know, storms have their excitement. One of the small groups is reading The Shack, and one of the opening paragraphs, so in the beginning of the book, a storm, an ice storm is coming in, and this guy, the story is set in Oregon, so it's a Pacific Northwest storm. An ice storm is coming in, and the character Mac reflects, there is something joyful about storms that interrupt routine. Snow or freezing rain suddenly releases you from expectations, performance demands, and the tyranny of appointments and schedules. And unlike illness, it is largely a corporate rather than an individual experience. One can almost hear a unified sigh rising from the nearby city and surrounding countryside, where nature has intervened to give respite to the weary human slogging it out within her purview. All those affected this way are united by a mutual excuse, and the heart is suddenly, unexpectedly, a little giddy. You remember children anticipating snowstorms, right? You've heard that excitement in them. But beyond their excitement, storms do have purposes. They have real benefits to all of creation. They oxygenate the water, they add nitrates to the soil, they produce ozone to refill that ozone layer, they break up red tide bacteria, they stir nutrients in the ocean so that they come up and can be eaten by marine life. Storms remove pollutants from the air. They remove old and weak vegetation, like around here when all the fir trees shed all their dead branches when we have a windstorm. They remove silt and sediment from the rivers and move it downstream into estuaries. We learned the hard way following Hurricane Katrina what the good thing is about all that sediment in the rivers, and if it doesn't get to wash downstream to the mouth of the river. You know, in New Orleans, there's a dike on each side of the river. The river is not allowed to carve away, and it's not allowed to change course by law. Did you know you could legislate a river? And every year they drag the river and they dig the silt out and they put it somewhere else, which means it's not flowing down and into the mouth, where it serves to feed and provide habitat for all kinds of growing critters and aquatic life. And it also serves as a speed bump when the storms come in, and it slows down the storm surges. And because we legislated the Mississippi River, we destroyed that benefit. And we here in the Northwest, remember that Elwha Dam up north of here? They took it out. And in just a couple of years, the sediment flowing from that has already started to recreate that estuary. And species that we have thought gone for good have already come back. When God created the heavens and the earth, God crafted infinitely intricate and interconnected ecosystems and people and critters and animals. We all work together. No one system can be impacted without affecting another or without affecting someone. The crazy electrical storm that we had last weekend provided incredible opportunities for photographers to catch great art, but it also left the neighbors, at least briefly, I hope it was briefly, without power. Bigger storms, monster storms like Hurricane Dorian, which leveled some of the islands in the Bahamas, was followed by another storm just this week, Hurricane Humberto. The number of people still missing from Dorian is still thought to be at least 1,300 people. They've accounted for those who have evacuated and gone somewhere else, but there are still 1,300 people that they don't know where they are. They know some of them were just washed away. Even as far away as you and I are, those storms affect us. They should affect us anyway. They should affect us economically as we send aid to them. They should impact us socially as we receive evacuees. They should impact us morally, for we have failed in caring for the whole of creation in a way that would mitigate those extreme storms. If we were doing our part, the storms might not be so bad. You know, China and the US are the two biggest polluters in the world. Now, China has 4 times the number of people that we do, but it only pollutes twice as much as we do. That means we pollute a lot, we in the US. And the next 2 top polluters are India and Russia. The thing that the US has that those other countries, China and Russia and India, don't have, is that the US claims to be a Christian nation that is following the scriptures about the story that God created the heavens and the earth and gave us care of all of that. Melody Zhang, who is a young adult woman, barely out of college at this point, she writes for Sojourners and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. This is what she writes. Responding to climate change is a moral imperative for 2 reasons. First, Genesis is clear that we have been entrusted by God with the keeping of all God's creatures and the earth itself. Yet, we have too often confused dominion with destruction. The biblical concept of dominion is a responsibility for the well-being of all creation. When we pollute the atmosphere with greenhouse gases or rely on oil that leaks and destroys the Gulf of Mexico, or allow mountaintop removal and fracking that devastates local water sources, we are not being responsible stewards of God's earth. Zhang continues, Christians are called to climate action on behalf of caring for other people. Jesus is clear, she writes, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Today, entire island nations like Kiribati are threatened by sea level rise and could disappear. Hurricanes regularly upend life in Puerto Rico and the Bahamas, and asthma rates keep rising in Black communities. Global patterns of disparity compound this. Communities in the global south are on the front lines of climate change, hit first and worst, even though they have done the least to cause climate change. How are we loving our neighbors, she asks. If we know that climate change is intensifying all these patterns and we do not respond to our neighbors suffering in a time of deep need. And you know, I find it interesting that while the Arctic up north is melting, it's the south of the globe that's experiencing water rising. Pastor Jenny Phillips is a pastor from the Pacific Northwest. Now she works for UMCOR. And she writes from her vantage point in UMCOR, it's very clear that extreme weather events are happening more frequently and with greater intensity than ever before, and that the ministries of our church are bearing the brunt. They are the frontiers of suffering and the front lines I'm sorry, they're the front lines of suffering and the front lines of recovery. I think she intended to say they see the front lines of suffering and the front lines of recovery. I don't think that she meant that our ministries are bearing the brunt of the storms, but our recovery efforts certainly are. We see those suffering firsthand and up close, and if you give to UMCOR, the entire East Coast, including Canada, was battered, but the Bahamas, the international UMCOR work, the Bahamas is the greatest need. Are we investing our human and financial resources in recovery? We are God's servants. When will we invest ourselves in the recovery of climate so that storms will be lessened? Just because storms provide benefits and opportunities does not mean that we should create them or make them worse. And that's true not just for tropical and climate storms. That's true also for the storms that come into our personal lives. You know, the Apostle Paul wrote from his perspective as one being persecuted and locked up in jail and arrested. He wrote to the church at Rome. It's almost like he's encouraging people to go out and find suffering. He writes, "We rejoice in our suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts, though the Holy Spirit has been given to us." I don't think Paul really means to say we rejoice that we get to suffer. I think he says that we can find joy even in the midst of our suffering. We can find joy even in the midst of the storms that we personally face. Jonathan Romaine, who's writing for The Guardian, writes, "Those who voluntarily take suffering on themselves are merely adding to human woes, rather than minimizing them. Why harm oneself when one could instead help others? If you want to feel good, rather than giving up chocolate for Lent, go and serve at the soup kitchen." He goes on to say, "For Jews, suffering is always an affront to the ideal human condition of one's own happiness. Religious duty is not to impose it further upon oneself or others, but to alleviate suffering as soon as possible. Forget the silver lining and get rid of the cloud, and certainly don't add one of your own." We need to be about mitigating the storms. Not just the climate storms, but also the personal storms in ours and other people's lives. The storms caused by politicians or stormy relationships with people we know. The storms that our children cause us, whether they're adults or younger than that. The storms that are caused in our body when illness grows. The storms that the uncertain economy creates in our heads as we worry about things. These are storms that will happen without regard to air pollution or water temperature. But like climate storms, we can stop adding to the causes. We can stop polluting and stop inserting our opinions where they're not wanted. That doesn't mean your children, your young children, can stop listening to you, but your adult children might not want your opinion. Have you heard that before? Stop polluting our bodies by doing things to them that we should not do. Take corrective actions. Only buy products that are made by responsible manufacturers. Apologize when it's right to do so. Vote for ethical candidates. Follow the prescriptions given to you by your doctors. Sometimes when storms come, we must simply sit and wait them out. But even then, the psalmist tells us that God will deliver us from the storms that hold us captive, that God will calm the waves and quiet the storms. Isaiah declares that God will be a strong and safe place that we can sit and wait the storm out. God will be the shade from the heat. And in his letter to Corinth, Paul writes, "Though we are afflicted in every way, we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. We're struck down, but not destroyed." And in Deuteronomy, some of Jesus' scriptures, we are reminded that the Lord goes before us and will be with us and will not forsake us. And so the scripture that Eric read for us this morning, Jesus reminds us to have faith. Have faith. Trust. Turn to Him and ask for help. He will calm the storms of the waters of our storms if we call on Him. He will stop the waves if we trust Him and move into His love. Trust Jesus. Trust the Spirit that He sends, and trust God's promises. So rainbow, it means remember. It means remember when the ark was resting on the top of Mount Ararat and the waters had faded away, God put the ark in the sky and said, I will remember. The rainbow is to remind me, God says, that I have made a covenant with you and I will remember. So whenever you see the rainbow, remember God's promises and God's covenant. God promises no more destruction of the total earth, no more war with God's people. God's promises to provide for us providential care. God will send what we need. It might not be physical, material stuff that God sends us, but God will send us what we need, even if it's not what we ask for. God will send us what we need, like strength to endure, like shelter in storms, like deliverance from waves that swamp us, like guidance and wisdom to know how to proceed, and righteous judgment and life. God will always give us life and more life and everlasting life. And one of the promises that I like the best is God promises to be our God and that we get to be God's beloved children. Thanks be to God.